December 6, 1942, RAF Chelmsford, England. A thick frost coated every surface at the airbase as Colonel Curtis LeMay faced the briefing room map. The unlit cigar rested firmly between his teeth, a familiar gesture of focus. Within 3 hours, the 3005th Bombardment Group under his command would dispatch 18 B-17 Flying Fortresses on a mission that had no precedent. The objective was Lille, France, yet the experiment lay not in the target itself but in the precise aerial formation the crews were about to fly. Unknown to the airmen. This sortie would lay the foundation for a defensive scheme so formidable that German pilots would soon nickname it the Flying Porcupine. The concept relied on interlocking fields of machine gun fire so dense that attacking the formation was virtually a calculated death sentence. The math behind it was straightforward but devastating. A single B-17G carried 1,350 rounds of 50 caliber machine guns. Multiply that by 54 bombers arranged in a combat wing formation, and an approaching fighter would face over 700 heavy guns capable of firing 750 rounds per minute, each with an effective range of 3,500 feet. This method, later known as the combat box, would redefine the daytime bombing strategy over Europe, converting a once perilous gamble into a powerful instrument for crippling Nazi Germany's industrial output. The journey to this innovation had begun with less auspicious results. On August 17, 1942, the 8th Air Force conducted its inaugural bombing mission from England. 12 B-17Es targeted the rail yards at Ron-Sorteville, France, with Spitfire escorts. Bombers flew in loosely arranged 6-plane squadrons, spaced 2 to 4 miles apart, more to prevent mid-air collisions among inexperienced crews than to enable mutual defense. Within squadrons, planes were staggered across 3 altitudes with roughly 150 feet separating the highest and lowest aircraft. All aircraft returned, suffering only minor flak damage on 2 planes. The operation underscored a sobering reality. Deeper penetration into occupied Europe would require self-defense, as the ultimate targets were well beyond the reach of available escort fighters. Strategic bombing doctrine mandated precision strikes during daylight on vital industrial facilities. Aircraft component factories, ball bearing plants, synthetic oil refineries, and other assets crucial to Germany's war effort. Reaching these sites required hundreds of miles over hostile airspace, exposing crews to both fighters and flak batteries. Missions from East Anglia to central Germany spanned over 500 miles each way. At cruising speeds near 180 mph, crews spent 8 to 10 hours at altitudes of 25,000 to 30,000 feet, where temperatures plummeted to 40 degrees Celsius and oxygen was a necessity. The B-17E represented a major step forward in defensive capability. Equipped with 50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns. 2 guns occupied a powered turret behind the cockpit. 2 more were mounted in the innovative Sperry ball turret beneath the fuselage, and the tail carried 2 manually operated guns. Additional firepower came from positions in the radio compartment, waist stations, and a flexible nose-mounted gun. Each Browning M2 weighed 64 pounds, measured 57 inches, and fired 750 rounds per minute to a maximum effective distance of 3,500 feet, significantly exceeding the reach of German 20mm MGFF cannons on early Luftwaffe fighters. The physical demands on gunners were extreme. The ball turret gunner, usually the smallest crew member, entered a 4-foot diameter enclosure through a hatch in the fuselage floor, remaining crouched in a fetal position for the entire mission without wearing a parachute. Should the aircraft be damaged, the gunner had to maneuver the turret to align the exit, retrieve the parachute, and bail out all potentially while the bomber spun out of control or burned. Waist gunners faced brutal cold, with wind speeds of 150 mph and temperatures well below freezing, relying on electrically heated suits that often failed. Frostbite was common. In November 1942, Luftwaffe ace Egon Meyer exposed a critical vulnerability in the B-17. He commanded the 3rd Group of Jagdgeschwader II and identified the bomber's forward section as weakly defended. The plexiglass nose, housing the bombardier and navigator, had only 2 manually operated 50 caliber guns with limited forward coverage. Behind them, the cockpit contained the pilot and co-pilot. Loss of the pilots almost guaranteed the bomber's destruction, even if the rest of the crew survived. LeMay determined that a head-on assault approaching directly from 12 o'clock allowed German pilots to concentrate fire on the bomber's most vulnerable area. This tactic required exceptional skill, as the attacker had mere seconds to inflict maximum damage before collision became a threat. On November 23, 1942, LeMay, with wingman Georg Peter Ader, shot down his first B-17 using this technique. Within weeks, head-on attacks became standard Luftwaffe practice. Closing speeds reached roughly 500 mph. The B-17 cruising at 180 mph met a German FW-109 at full speed, roughly 320 mph, leaving only 320 mph, leaving only 3 seconds for the attacker to open fire effectively, often enough to devastate the bomber's nose and cockpit. This precise tactical problem, the lethal vulnerability of the B-17 head-on, was the challenge Colonel Curtis LeMay set out to resolve that winter. The mission on December 6, 1942 would mark the beginning of a revolutionary approach in bomber defense. A dense, overlapping formation that transformed daylight bombing from high-risk ventures into a strategically viable, industrial strangling weapon. Colonel LeMay, at the age of 36, was in command of the 3005th Bombardment Group. He had assumed leadership of the unit on June 2, 1942, bringing with him over a decade of experience that had established him as one of the most skilled navigators in military aviation. His expertise in charting courses and guiding aircraft under challenging conditions was widely recognized. In August 1937, while serving as the navigator on a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress under the command of pilot Caleb Haynes, LeMay successfully located the USS Utah during a training exercise off the coast of California, even though the Navy had provided inaccurate coordinates. Less than a year later, in May 1938, he guided 3 B-17 seconds across 620 nautical miles of open ocean to intercept the Italian passenger liner SS Rex, approximately 725 miles from the U.S. coastline. This achievement captured considerable public attention, demonstrating both the long-range capabilities of the B-17 and LeMay's exceptional navigational precision. By the time he took command of the 3005th, LeMay had already formulated a clear vision for bomber operations. He insisted that accuracy in bombing required steady, level flight during the final approach to the target, regardless of anti-aircraft fire or enemy fighter engagement. The Norden bomb site, central to precision bombing, demanded this stability to ensure the correct release point for ordnance. Additionally, he recognized the critical importance of maintaining close formation. Isolated aircraft were highly vulnerable, while tightly grouped bombers could concentrate their defensive fire, creating protective zones that shielded the formation from enemy fighters. LeMay also emphasized rigorous training, insisting that every crew member's response become automatic under the stresses of combat. LeMay was known among his crews as exacting, emotionally detached, and wholly committed to mission success. He pushed his men relentlessly but also led from the front, personally flying the most dangerous sorties. Early bomber formations proved insufficient. 6 plane squadrons operating with 2 to 4 miles of separation offered no mutual protection. Defensive D-50 caliber guns with an effective range of just over half a mile could not support each other effectively. LeMay sought a formation that balanced concentrated defensive firepower with the ability to deliver bombs accurately while minimizing collision risk. In October 1942, the 8th Air Force adopted a 3-plane V formation. This arrangement, with 1 lead plane flanked by 2 wingmen flying in close proximity, became the foundational tactical unit for subsequent missions. Yet 3 planes alone were inadequate for the defensive needs of the bomber groups. In December 1942, LeMay introduced the Javelin Down formation, a significant tactical innovation. The Javelin Down formation consisted of 18 aircraft, organized both horizontally and vertically to resemble the profile of a spearhead. The planes were arranged into 6 3-plane elements, grouped into 3 squadrons. Each squadron contained 2 elements, stacked vertically with the lead squadron in the center. the high squadron positioned above and offset to one side, and the low squadron below and offset to the opposite side. A key element of this formation was orienting the planes in the direction of the sun, allowing gunners in higher aircraft to see lower planes without glare interference, while simultaneously generating overlapping fields of fire to cover every possible attack vector. The formation spanned 600 feet from the lowest to the highest aircraft, extended 500 feet from front to rear, and stretched nearly 2,500 feet across laterally. This arrangement allowed every bomber to bring its defensive armament to bear on enemy fighters approaching from virtually any direction. On December 6, 1942, the 3005th Bombardment Group employed the Javelin Down formation in combat for the first time during a mission targeting La France. Departing from RAF Chelveston, 18 B-17Fs ascended to operational altitude and assumed the new formation. German fighters attempted several attacks on the approaching bombers, but the concentrated defensive fire proved impenetrable. Enemy aircraft found themselves under simultaneous attack from multiple bombers, demonstrating the tactical advantage and protective capability of LeMay's formation. During the early stages of the Allied bombing campaign over Europe, a new tactical formation emerged that dramatically increased the defensive firepower of B-17 bombers. By arranging the aircraft so that the guns of multiple bombers overlapped, the formation created lethal zones of concentrated fire, leaving attacking fighters highly exposed. The concept, initially developed by Major Paul LeMay, proved so effective that other B-17 units stationed in England, including the 90 Honest, 303rd, and 306th bomb groups, adopted it almost immediately after reviewing mission reports. LeMay continued refining the design, and by January 1943, the formation had evolved into a 21-plane wedge. To strengthen the squadron most susceptible to enemy attack, he added a third trio of bombers to its ranks. In the Javelin Down arrangement, the low squadron positioned beneath and behind the lead squadron was particularly vulnerable. German pilots quickly learned to exploit this, approaching from below where the bombers' silhouettes stood out against the sky. Reinforcing the low squadron with 3 additional aircraft concentrated defensive firepower exactly where it was most needed. Combat testing confirmed the effectiveness of this configuration, and it was officially standardized across all groups on January 13, 1943, remaining the standard through September of that year. When viewed from different angles, the formation took on distinct geometric shapes. From the front, the bombers appeared stacked like a staircase. From the side, the arrangement resembled the tip of a spear, and from above, it formed a diamond. Each bomber occupied a precisely assigned location, identified by squadron, element, and position number. The lead squadron comprised 9 planes, with 3 more bombers added to the high squadron's right and 9 to the low squadron's left, bringing the total to 21. Maintaining one's assigned spot was absolutely critical. An Army Air Forces survey conducted in 1943 revealed that over half of the B-17 seconds lost to German fighters during European missions had strayed from the main formation. Flying a B-17 in such a tightly coordinated combat formation demanded extraordinary physical stamina and continuous concentration. Pilots had to sustain precise speed, altitude, and spatial positioning while encumbered by heavy flight suits, oxygen masks, and full gear in temperatures as low as -40 degrees. The turbulence generated by the prowash of lead bombers compounded the challenge, producing chaotic air currents that extended hundreds of feet behind each plane. Without power-assisted controls, maneuvering the yoke, rudder pedals, and throttles required considerable muscular effort. After hours of maintaining formation at high altitude, pilots' arms were often numb and fatigued, yet the defensive value of the combat box was undeniable. The formation's effectiveness was dramatically demonstrated during early 1943 missions. On January 27, the 8th Air Force launched its first bombing raid on German soil, targeting the naval facilities at Wilhelmshaven. A total of 53 B-17 seconds and 20 B-24 seconds took part, with the 305th Bomb Group flying in the newly developed combat box. German fighters intercepted the bombers over the Frisian Islands and engaged with customary aggression. However, The overlapping defensive fire of the tightly knit formations forced attackers to break off sooner than they would have against looser arrangements, and accurate shooting became far more difficult. The mission resulted in the loss of only 3 bombers, a casualty rate slightly over 4%, a stark contrast to the 20% losses later suffered on unescorted missions deep into enemy territory. Despite these improvements, one persistent vulnerability remained. The forward-facing armament of the B-17 was relatively weak. While the combat box provided formidable protection from the sides, above, below, and rear, head-on attacks continued to pose a deadly threat. German pilots quickly adapted their tactics throughout 1943, honing methods to exploit this weakness, ensuring that the struggle between bomber formations and fighter attacks remained a dynamic and deadly contest. Fighter aircraft would position themselves in advance of the bomber formations, preparing for coordinated attack runs. The standard tactic involved approaching the enemy in small groups, typically 3 or 4 planes flying side by side in what was known as a K formation. These units would close in directly on the lead bombers. Once the distance closed to roughly 1,000 yards, they would unleash a combination of 20mm cannon fire and 13mm machine gun bursts. Later variants of the 190 were armed with 4 151 20mm cannons and 2 MG-17 machine guns, allowing a formidable concentration of fire. As the fighters closed to about 500 yards, pilots executed a final burst of gunfire before breaking off with abrupt, high-speed maneuvers. Elite German pilots often waited until the bombers were only 300 yards away or closer, maximizing the destructive potential of their attack. The American response to the threat posed by heavily armed fighters focused on improving forward-facing defenses on their bombers. Early experiments included mounting a single 50-caliber machine gun on each side of the aircraft's nose, allowing the bombardier and navigator to target attackers approaching from the front. While these cheap-mounted guns partially reduced blind spots, their limited arcs meant attackers could still exploit weak points. A major advancement came with the introduction of the remotely operated nose, or chin, turret, equipped with twin 50-caliber machine guns. The Bendix-designed turret was electrically powered and could be aimed using a hand control while the gunner looked through a reflector sight. This setup enabled true forward firing capability and allowed tracking of targets across a broad frontal arc, providing unprecedented coverage against head-on assaults. By the summer of 1943, the B-17G Flying Fortress began entering service with the chin turret as standard. This version became the most heavily armed American bomber, featuring 13 50-caliber machine guns distributed across multiple defensive positions. 2 guns in the Bendix chin turret defended the aircraft from frontal attacks, supplemented by the manual cheek guns on each side of the nose. The dorsal turret, operated by the flight engineer just behind the cockpit, covered the upper and lateral sectors. A Sperry ball turret mounted in the aircraft's belly protected against attacks from below. Waist gunners, one on each side of the fuselage, provided coverage of the beam angles, while the radio operator's flexible gun could cover both upper and rear arcs. Finally, a twin-gun tail turret defended the bomber's rear, maintaining the longest effective firing range of approximately 1,000 yards. Collectively, these positions allowed comprehensive defensive coverage, effectively surrounding the bomber with overlapping fields of fire. A full B-17G crew comprised 10 men, each assigned specialized responsibilities. The pilot commanded the aircraft and oversaw crew operations, while the co-pilot assisted in flying and monitoring engine systems, taking control if the pilot became incapacitated. The navigator handled all aspects of course plotting and flight planning. The bombardier operated the Norden bomb site during bombing runs and manned the chin turret outside these periods. The flight engineer monitored engine health, fuel usage, hydraulic pressure, and electrical systems while also operating the top turret. The radio operator managed all communications and the radio room gun. The ball turret gunner spent nearly the entire mission in his spherical turret beneath the aircraft. 2 waist gunners maintained defensive coverage on either side of the rear fuselage, and the tail gunner alone occupied the rear turret, lying prone for extended periods while scanning for pursuing enemy fighters. In response to the growing defensive capabilities of Allied bombers, the Luftwaffe sought to increase the firepower of its own aircraft and refine attack tactics. Post-mission analyses of downed B-17 seconds indicated that destroying a fully armed heavy bomber from the rear generally required about 20 hits from 20mm shells, highlighting the formidable challenge posed by these heavily defended aircraft. Analysis of combat recordings captured through aircraft-mounted guns revealed a stark reality. Pilots of average skill were able to strike enemy bombers from the rear with only about 2% of the rounds they fired. The implications were severe. To score 20 hits on a bomber, a typical pilot would need to expend roughly 1,020 rounds of 20mm ammunition, far beyond the 500 rounds carried by the early Focke-Wulf W190. Even if a pilot emptied their guns completely, the average damage amounted to only about 10 impacts, insufficient to guarantee the destruction of a target. This shortfall drove the development of heavier armament. Later Tyne-D models were outfitted with 4 or 6 MG 151 20mm cannons, supplemented by twin MG 131 13mm machine guns. In addition, experimental aircraft mounted even larger cannons. Notable examples included the Bordkanone BK-37, a 37mm automatic cannon, and the Mk-103, a 30mm cannon designed to obliterate a bomber with 1 or 2 direct hits. While these weapons dramatically increased lethality, they were cumbersome, degraded flight performance, and offered only a very limited ammunition supply. The Luftwaffe also explored the use of unguided rockets. The WFR Granate 21, WGR-21, was a 21 cm rocket fired from simple tube launchers beneath the wings. Its destructive power was immense. A direct strike could annihilate a B-17, yet aiming was exceptionally challenging. The rockets suffered from poor ballistics and had no guidance, forcing pilots to engage from distances of 800 to 1,000 yards well outside the reach of defensive fire. Hit probabilities were extremely low, but their presence exerted a powerful psychological effect. Observing these smoke-trailing rockets, bomber crews often executed evasive maneuvers, disrupting their formations and compromising bombing accuracy. By 1943, as the 8th Air Force expanded, bomber formations had to evolve to accommodate increasing numbers of aircraft. Spring of that year saw the 8th grow to 16 groups of B-17 seconds and 4 groups of B-24 Liberators, with missions sometimes comprising 100 to 200 bombers. The traditional group formation of 18 to 21 aircraft was combined into larger combat wing formations. 3 groups flying together, arranged both vertically and laterally, produced a 54-plane wing capable of delivering overwhelming defensive firepower. This wing box became the standard structure for major missions from early 1943 through May 1944. Within these formations, the lead group flew in the center, a high group positioned above and to one side, and a low group below and to the opposite side. The wing box occupied an airspace approximately 3,000 feet high, 7,000 feet deep, and 2,000 feet across. A fully equipped 54-plane wing could collectively deploy around 700 heavy-caliber defensive guns. For example, 54 B-17 seconds, each armed with 13 guns, resulted in nearly 700 heavy machine guns threatening any attacking fighter. From a distance, the formations resembled porcupines with countless tracer streams, creating a deadly visual barrier. German pilots nicknamed these arrangements Fliegende Stachelschwein, or flying porcupines, reflecting both the appearance and the challenge of assaulting them. Luftwaffe Oberleutnant Heinrich Knoke, credited with 33 victories while serving in JG-11, described the intensity of such attacks in his combat diary. Approaching the American bombers was akin to flying into a wall of fire. Tracers radiated from every direction. Even as a pilot lined up a shot, the surrounding air would suddenly blaze with red streaks. Firing his own guns, he would attempt to hit a bomber while maneuvering to avoid damage, a dangerous high-stakes exercise. Major Anton Haeckel, who finished the war with 192 confirmed victories, elaborated on the tactical difficulties. An attack from the rear meant enduring a long approach from 1,000 meters to within 400 meters, the effective firing range of the fighter, while being fully exposed to the bomber's guns, which outranged the W190's armament. Head-on attacks offered a shorter exposure due to higher closing speeds but demanded exceptional skill and courage. Despite these challenges, the rigid formation discipline imposed by the combat box ensured a strong mutual defense, yet also created a tactical vulnerability that could not be entirely mitigated. During World War II, individual bombers flying in formation were unable to maneuver freely. To maintain the integrity of their defensive formations, crews had to fly straight and level, holding their positions regardless of incoming enemy fire or fighter attacks. This rigidity made them especially vulnerable to German anti-aircraft artillery. By the height of the air war, the Luftwaffe's Flak units had grown to over 1 million personnel, operating thousands of heavy guns designed to defend key locations. The most feared German anti-aircraft weapon was the 8.8 cm Flak 1836-3741 series, capable of firing an 8.8 kg high-explosive shell to altitudes above 30,000 feet. These guns were deployed in strategic batteries around critical industrial and military targets. When a bomber formation approached, German crews would calculate the aircraft's projected location 30 seconds ahead and saturate that airspace with exploding shells, maximizing the chance of a hit. Flak accounted for roughly 40% of all injuries suffered by the 8th Air Force, surpassing the damage inflicted by Luftwaffe fighters. The effectiveness and vulnerabilities of the combat box formation were thoroughly tested during the deep penetration raids of August and October 1943. These operations pushed American strategic bombing doctrine to its limits, highlighting both the protective strengths and lethal weaknesses of unescorted formations. On August 17, 1943, exactly 1 year after the 8th Air Force conducted its first mission, a massive dual raid was launched. 376 B-17 bombers targeted the Messerschmitt aircraft factory in Regensburg and the ball-bearing plants in Schweinfurt. The operation was unprecedented in scale and ambition. Curtis LeMay, who was then commanding the 3rd Air Division, personally led the Regensburg strike. This force comprised 146 B-17 seconds from 7 groups and was tasked with bombing the factory before continuing southward across the Alps to bases in North Africa. The Schweinfurt force, made up of 230 B-17 seconds from 9 groups, was scheduled to follow and return to England. Weather disrupted the operation from the start. Dense fog over English airfields delayed takeoffs, creating a 3-hour gap between the 2 strikes instead of the planned 30 minutes, effectively dismantling the coordinated tactical plan. German radar systems tracked both formations from the moment they departed. The delay allowed Luftwaffe controllers to cycle fighter units landing, rearming, refueling, and relaunching before the bombers reached their targets. The Regensburg group encountered waves of German fighters immediately upon crossing the Dutch coast. Messerschmitt Bf 109 seconds and Focke-Wulf W 190 seconds struck head-on, often with 3 or 4 aircraft attacking a single lead bomber at once. Despite these assaults, the formations pressed on, and the bombing of the Messerschmitt factory was precise and damaging. Still, losses were severe. 24 B-17 seconds were destroyed. The Schweinfurt group suffered even heavier casualties. Their delayed approach meant that the German fighters already engaged with Regensburg could return to base, refuel, and mount a second attack. Of the 183 bombers that reached the Schweinfurt target, 36 were lost. Overall, the raids resulted in 60 bombers destroyed and around 600 crewmen killed or missing, a staggering 20% loss rate. Post-mission assessments revealed that the combat box formation functioned exactly as designed. Analysis showed that the majority of bombers shot down had drifted away from the main formation. Aircraft that fell out due to mechanical issues, battle damage, or pilot error were quickly overwhelmed by enemy fighters. Once isolated from the concentrated defensive fire of the formation, a bomber rarely survived more than 5 minutes. Conversely, aircraft that adhered to their positions benefited from overlapping fields of defensive fire, which often forced attackers to break off, reduced bombing accuracy, and sometimes even resulted in the destruction of the attacking fighters. These raids demonstrated the dual nature of the combat box. It provided a robust defensive network allowing bombers to reach heavily fortified German targets and inflict serious damage, yet its effectiveness was heavily dependent on maintaining formation integrity. Without long-range fighter escorts to engage Luftwaffe aircraft before they reached the bombers, losses remained devastating and unsustainable. In mid-1943, no fighter possessed the range to accompany bombers deep into German territory. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt had sufficient combat performance to face German fighters effectively, but with internal fuel alone, it could escort bombers only about 125 miles from base. The introduction of 75-gallon drop tanks in August extended the radius to roughly 230 miles, while 108-gallon tanks deployed in September pushed it to 275 miles. This range sufficed for operations in the Low Countries, northern France and western Germany, but fell short for missions targeting central Germany. While awaiting true long-range escorts, the 8th Air Force continued to refine the combat box to improve its defensive efficiency. By September 1943, a new 36-plane formation was tested. This arrangement doubled the number of 3 plane elements per squadron and positioned all 3 planes within the same altitude bracket, reducing the risk of mid-air collisions. The result was a more compact, manageable formation that concentrated bombing power and strengthened defensive coverage, further illustrating the ongoing evolution of American strategic bombing tactics in the face of relentless German opposition. By the end of 1943, American bomber groups had developed flexible formation strategies for daylight raids over Europe. They could deploy in compact formations of 21 aircraft for smaller-scale missions, extend to 36 plane arrangements when precision bombing was crucial, or consolidate into 54 plane wing formations to maximize defensive firepower. Each configuration aimed to balance protection against enemy fighters with bombing effectiveness, a delicate trade-off in the increasingly lethal skies over Germany. The ultimate test of these tactics occurred on October 14, 1943, when the 8th Air Force undertook a second attempt to neutralize the Schweinfurt ball-bearing factories, a target of critical industrial importance. This operation, later remembered as Black Thursday, marked the deadliest single day in the history of the 8th Air Force. From airfields scattered across East Anglia, 291 B-17 flying fortresses took off in challenging weather conditions. Thick cloud cover and high winds delayed the formation assembly, nearly causing the mission to be called off. Yet, given the strategic necessity of crippling Germany's ball-bearing production, the order to proceed was issued. Escort support proved inadequate. Only around half of the P-47 Thunderbolts scheduled to accompany the bombers managed to join the formations. As the B-17 seconds approached the Aachen region near the German-Belgian frontier, the P-47 seconds performed a customary wingwag farewell and returned home, their fuel reserves depleted. This left the bomber stream to continue unprotected deep into German airspace. Once inside enemy territory, the Luftwaffe executed a coordinated, overwhelming assault. German radar controllers had tracked the bombers from takeoff, and every available fighter unit in Western Germany was scrambled. Waves of more than 300 fighters, single-engine Messerschmitt Bf-109 seconds and Focke-Wulf W-190 seconds flying in tight formations attacked head-on, using aggressive maneuvers designed to inflict maximum damage. These were followed by twin-engine fighters launching WGR-21 rockets from distances of roughly 1,000 yards. The rocket attacks forced the bomber formations to scatter, shattering the defensive combat box arrangements that had provided mutual protection. The Germans had refined their tactics specifically to disrupt formation cohesion. They concentrated on individual bomber groups, overwhelming localized defenses, and pursuing damaged aircraft that fell behind. Many Luftwaffe pilots operated from bases within 50 miles of the bomber routes, allowing them to rearm and refuel quickly, returning to strike the same formations multiple times. By the time the B-17 seconds reached Schweinfurt, 28 bombers had already been destroyed. The 305th Bomb Group, previously commanded by LeMay, suffered especially heavy losses. Positioned in the most vulnerable lower section of the formation, they absorbed repeated attacks, losing 13 aircraft, the highest number of any group on the mission. Among these losses, 130 men were either killed, captured, or went missing. Despite the chaos, post-strike reconnaissance confirmed that the bombing had inflicted serious damage on the targeted production facilities. However, the human and material cost was staggering. Of the 291 bombers that departed England, 60 were shot down, and another 17 returned so severely damaged that they were deemed unserviceable. A further 121 aircraft returned with varying levels of battle damage. Overall, more than a quarter of the force, 26%, was lost or incapacitated. Aircrew casualties were similarly grim. 650 of the 2,900 men participating in the raid did not survive or were captured, representing a 22% casualty rate. At this level of risk, the odds of completing the standard 25 mission tour were extremely low. Staff Sergeant Harold Monroe Graham, a ball turret gunner with the 305th, had flown 27 successful missions prior to Black Thursday. The night before the raid, he wrote to his family, acknowledging the danger yet emphasizing the protective role of formation flying. His bomber was destroyed over Schweinfurt, taking multiple direct hits before entering a fatal spin. Only 3 parachutes were observed leaving the aircraft, and Graham, just 22 years old, did not survive. Analysis of the operation underscored the life-saving value of disciplined formation flying. Aircraft that maintained their positions in the combat box had a significantly higher probability, over 50%, of returning safely. In contrast, bombers that fell out of formation faced almost certain destruction. The concentrated defensive fire of the combat box downed some German fighters, damaged others, and forced attackers to break off engagements earlier than they might have. Otherwise, however, without sufficient fighter escort, even the tightest formation could not prevent catastrophic losses. The aftermath of Black Thursday prompted a major re-evaluation of American strategic bombing doctrine. Casualty rates were simply unsustainable, making the 25-mission tour goal virtually impossible. For the remainder of 1943, the 8th Air Force restricted its operations to targets within the range of escort fighters, and missions deep into central and southern Germany were postponed indefinitely. Black Thursday had demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of daylight precision bombing under enemy fire, fundamentally shaping the strategy of the Allied air campaign for the months to come. The setbacks experienced by Allied bomber forces during the early years of the strategic air campaign should not be seen as outright defeats, but rather as a period of operational recalibration while solutions were sought. The most significant of these solutions was the development and deployment of long-range fighter escorts capable of accompanying bombers deep into enemy territory. By the latter part of 1943, the North American P-51B Mustang began entering service with the 8th Air Force. Fitted with a Packard-manufactured Rolls-Royce Merlin engine and external drop tanks, this aircraft possessed an operational radius exceeding 650 miles, sufficient to protect bombers on missions reaching Berlin and back. In addition to this exceptional range, the Mustang offered superior performance at altitudes around 30,000 feet, the operational ceiling of both Allied bombers and Luftwaffe interceptors, allowing it to compete effectively against formidable German fighters such as the Bf-109 and Fw-190. The introduction of P-51-equipped fighter groups to bomber escort duties in February 1944 marked a turning point in air operations over Europe. While the combat box formation tight groupings of bombers designed to maximize mutual defense remained a standard tactic, its function shifted. With capable fighter cover now available, the primary purpose of maintaining rigid formations was less about survival and more about ensuring bombing precision. Cohesive formations concentrated bombs on targets more effectively, amplifying their destructive impact. As the Luftwaffe's fighter threat waned throughout 1944, anti-aircraft fire, or Flak, emerged as the principal hazard for bomber crews. The smaller 36-plane group formation, which was more manageable than the larger 54-plane wing box, became the norm for most missions after May 1944. By the time the 8th Air Force returned to Schweinfurt for the high-intensity missions of Big Week in February 1944, the air campaign had undergone a dramatic transformation. P-51 Mustangs could escort bombers to the target and back without interruption, while the B-17G's 13 defensive guns provided formidable protection. Years of combat experience had refined the combat box, and the Luftwaffe was beginning to collapse under relentless attrition. Experienced German pilots were being lost faster than they could be replaced, and the strategic bombing campaign that had seemed precarious in late 1943 was now producing tangible results. By the time of the D-Day landings on June 6, 1944, the Allies had effectively secured air superiority over Western Europe. German fighters had largely been neutralized, enabling bomber formations to operate with minimal interference over much of Germany. Loss rates dropped dramatically from around 20% in October 1943 to between 3 and 5% by mid-1944, levels that allowed crews to complete the standard 20. The psychological effect was equally important. New crews arriving in the theater could see veterans who had successfully returned from tours, reinforcing the notion that survival was attainable. The combat box's effectiveness is further underscored by statistical analysis of B-17 losses. Of the 12,731 B-17 seconds produced during the war, 4,735 were lost in combat, reflecting a cumulative loss rate of 37%. Yet bombers that maintained formation discipline consistently enjoyed significantly higher survival chances than the average, whereas aircraft that fell out of formation faced extreme peril, often being shot down within minutes. Remaining within the combat box could mean the difference between life and death. A plane that held its position often had better than a 50% chance of returning safely, even on heavily defended missions. Technical Sergeant Albert Brown, a radio operator in the 305th Bomb Group, emphasized this in a letter later preserved by the National Air Force Museum. The survival of each bomber depended entirely on collective discipline. Straying from the formation invited immediate attack from enemy fighters, while sticking to one's position ensured mutual protection from both flak and hostile aircraft. Despite these tactical improvements, the human cost of the combined bomber offensive remained immense. The 8th Air Force alone suffered approximately 54,000 casualties, including 26,000 killed in action and 28,000 captured. Nevertheless, the integration of long-range fighter escorts, rigorous formation tactics, and accumulated combat experience transformed the strategic air campaign from a precarious endeavor into a systematically effective operation, establishing air supremacy over Europe and ensuring that bomber crews could complete missions with a measurable chance of survival. To grasp the scale of the 8th Air Force's sacrifices, it is striking to note that their losses in Europe surpassed the total casualties suffered by the entire U.S. SUF Marine Corps in the Pacific Theater. The heaviest toll occurred during the latter half of 1943, a period when deep penetration bombing raids conducted without sufficient fighter protection resulted in attrition rates that were almost impossible to sustain. The courage demanded of the air crews cannot be overstated. Climbing into a B-17 knowing that survival odds were slim, navigating through intense anti-aircraft fire, enduring relentless attacks from enemy fighters, and maintaining formation cohesion when every instinct screamed to break apart. The stark reality of combat in the skies over Germany was unforgiving. A standard combat wing of 54 B-17 bombers carried over 700 heavy machine guns, each capable of firing 750 rounds per minute with a reach of approximately 3,500 feet. These weapons were positioned in 3 dimensions to create overlapping fields of fire, leaving no angle unprotected. Any Luftwaffe pilot attempting to engage the formation faced a lethal gauntlet that lasted several seconds. German reports confirmed that assaults on well-organized bomber formations were extraordinarily hazardous. The defensive firepower often forced attackers to break off early, disrupted their aim, and sometimes destroyed their aircraft outright. The combat box formation also exemplified a distinctly American approach to warfare, one that combined technical ingenuity, industrial output, and tactical experimentation. Unlike other nations that might have abandoned daylight bombing after heavy losses, the United States sought a methodical solution. Military planners analyzed the weaknesses of loosely organized formations, studied patterns of attrition, tested various configurations, and refined tactics based on combat feedback. Achieving this solution required vast industrial effort to produce thousands of heavily armed bombers, each outfitted with 13 machine guns and 7,500 rounds of ammunition. Constructing 12,000 B-17 seconds alone demanded millions of man-hours and coordination across multiple states. Beyond production, the United States established training programs capable of preparing tens of thousands of pilots, navigators, bombardiers, and gunners to function as integrated teams. Managing the logistics of instructing, deploying, and inserting these crews into operational missions posed an organizational challenge as complex as the combat itself. The combat box was more than a tactical arrangement. It represented a demonstration of American industrial capacity, organizational skill, and technological advantage applied to solve a critical battlefield problem. Initially, German pilots enjoyed superior training and the advantage of fighting over home territory. Yet, they could not match the scale of American production or the ability to orchestrate mass operations. The combat box embodied this strategic edge. Only a nation capable of producing thousands of heavy bombers and coordinating large-scale formations could execute such a plan effectively. When Curtis LeMay first tested the concept over Leh on December 6, 1942, he was tackling a theoretical solution to a tactical challenge. He calculated the defensive coverage of multiple gun positions, studied the vulnerabilities of loose formations, and devised a layout that maximized overlapping fire. By the war's conclusion in May 1945, the combat box had become the benchmark for bomber formations. More than 12,000 B-17 seconds flew missions using variations of this formation, delivering over 640,000 tons of bombs on German industrial and military targets. Factories, oil refineries, transportation hubs, and military installations were systematically destroyed, and the Luftwaffe was drawn into a war of attrition it could not win. The campaigns demonstrated that with precise tactics, robust armament, and exceptional crew proficiency, daylight bombing could be executed successfully, even in the face of determined opposition. Crews were acutely aware of the dangers. Pre-mission briefings informed them of projected loss rates. They saw the empty beds of fallen comrades and attended memorial services before their own missions. Completing a 25-mission tour required not only skill and bravery, but also a measure of luck. Personal rituals, writing letters home in case of death, praying, carrying talismans were part of how crews mentally prepared for flights. They dressed, checked equipment, and boarded aircraft with deliberate focus, determined to accomplish the mission despite the risks. The significance of the combat box extends beyond tactical effectiveness. It reflected the core doctrine of the Army Air Forces: daylight precision bombing over heavily defended targets. While the Royal Air Force had abandoned daytime raids due to catastrophic losses, the Americans remained committed, believing that destroying key industrial facilities was crucial for victory. The combat box made this feasible by concentrating defensive firepower to a level that German fighters could not easily penetrate. Operating in these formations demanded extraordinary stamina, discipline, and courage. Bombers flew for 8 to 10 hours at high altitude, often in freezing temperatures, under constant fighter attack and amid flak explosions. Thousands of crews endured these conditions repeatedly, with many volunteering for additional missions after completing their required tours. A shared sense of purpose, the belief that they were shortening the war and saving lives, sustained them through experiences that would have overwhelmed lesser individuals. In the annals of aerial combat, few innovations have had such a profound impact or demanded such extreme bravery. The combat box stands as a testament to American ingenuity, industrial power, and the valor of young men, many just 23 years old, from farms and small towns across the nation. These men faced seemingly insurmountable odds not out of compulsion but out of conviction, to end tyranny, defend freedom, and protect loved ones. The psychological scars were lasting, yet their accomplishments endure. The combat box exemplifies what ordinary individuals can achieve when called to extraordinary action, accomplished through a combination of technological expertise, organizational skill, and the indomitable courage of those who refuse to surrender to adversity.